We are moving to the last presentation of this session. It's going to be given by Jonathan Hearn, who is a researcher in the Department of Sociology, School of Social and Political Science of the University of Edinburgh. And it addresses the topic of how do ethnographic records become historical documents, the transition from ethnography to history. So Jonathan, all yours.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just say this talk may be sort of the joker in the pack, in that it may take a while before I get around to talking about documents, because the whole question of this presentation, which is just some reflections on some attempts to take some rather old research of mine and turn it into a book in my spare time, whenever that is. It's reflections on that, and I'll just preface it by saying that I was trained as a cultural anthropologist, and a lot of my work, when I first finished my PhD and had my first job here, was kind of ethnographic kind of work. I now do stuff that's more political and historical and more like some kind of normal sociologist. But some of this talk reflects that kind of transition I was going through. And so yes, it's going to be a lot of it's about just precisely when do documents become historical. So let me talk about the research project that this came out of for a second, and I'll talk about that for a couple of slides, and then I'll kind of move into questions this raises about coming back to this data. The project I'm involved in, or was involved in, was part of the Leverhulme Constitutional Change and National Identity Program, which ran from 1999 to 2005. It was a very large Leverhulme program, interdisciplinary teams, social psychologists, sociologists, anthropologists, various kinds of people doing different kinds of sub-studies within this larger project. And the whole premise of it was looking at, is constitutional change, devolution in Scotland, affecting national identity? One of our main findings overall was not much. There's so much national identity around, you can't add much to it. But that's this study that I did, which was an ethnographic study of the Bank of Scotland during its first year of merger with Halifax to form something, the dear departed H-Boss. That was my part of it, was doing this. No lights. It was doing this ethnography for a year in the bank, where I went in, wore a suit, and hung out with people and tried to peek over the computer screen and see what people were doing and talk to them a lot. And that ran from 2001 and 2002, sort of during the early part of this larger research program. Originally, it had been planned to be just a study of the Bank of Scotland, but between the time of negotiating access and doing the research, they had decided to merge with Halifax. So what had originally been thought of as a kind of just looking at how a staid national institution in Scotland, the Bank of Scotland, which has been around since 1695, kind of framed national identity, suddenly was changed because they were merging with an English bank, which was suddenly making a lot of implicit issues much more explicit during the field work period. And the kind of questions that we were dealing with in this research were, well, how do people do national identity on an everyday basis? We were trying to, rather than looking at, political parties, football clubs, places where sometimes national identity is kind of heated up and very strong, we thought, well, we'll go into a more banal, everyday setting and kind of look at how the institution shapes people's sense of identity and how it comes into play in a kind of routine, everyday sort of sense. So how do large institutions frame and shape that process of sort of enacting national identity in a sort of banal, everyday way? And this notion of kind of banal nationalism was a kind of big at the time. A book had recently come out by a fellow named Michael Billig with the title Banal Nationalism, and it was also at the same time in anthropology a lot of stuff talk about the everyday and reconstructing everyday experience, kind of in another sense of phenomenology, like Willie was talking about. We're all kind of in the air at the time and sort of shaping decisions about how to construct the research. So I did, let me just pop back. I did that, did some writing on it, published some stuff. Life moves on. By about 2007, 2008, last things are coming out, and I'm on to other things, right? And then something big happens in the world of banking. The financial crisis of, people usually peg it to 2008, 2007, 2008. That's when it started really revealing itself, hits, and all sorts of things. We all know, I won't go through all the, everything that went wrong in the banking world, but terrible crisis. HBOS is one of the victims, I don't know if victim's the right word, of this crisis. They were seriously overexposed to a lot of bad debts in property, commercial property, despite the fact that Halifax is a major, mortgage lender for private homes and stuff. The way this process works is as the bank gets more and more vulnerable, people in their high finance area keep borrowing more and more to buy huge amounts of commercial property, thinking that this will fix everything in the long run, and surprise, surprise, it didn't. So, banking crash, this is a representation of Halifax falling apart. Eventually, Alistair Darling and Gordon Brown arrange takeover of HBOS by Lloyd's TSB, a kind of shotgun wedding, because they didn't want to save another bank like they had saved Northern Rock not long before. So everything changes, and from the I studied one merger, and before I turned around, the whole thing swallowed up by yet another thing. This, I just like to mention this this image you can get off the net. If you're talking to an old Bank of Scotland person who was not terribly happy with the merger with Halifax in the first place, I think they're to blame with what happened. The positioning of the Lloyd's horse and the Halifax sign is significant. It's suggesting something. So there's a bit of sardonic commentary going on there. Okay, I'll try and start moving. That's a lot of background, but kind of necessary in this case. So history has moved on. Same themes, new significance. I mean, again, coming back to the kinds of things I was looking at originally in the original research before the banking crisis. As I said, questions of national identity. How is national identity, which is also for the people you're talking to in an ethnographic setting, part of their personal identity. You can't completely disarticulate these things. And organizational culture, how do these things interact? What's it like working in a bank that thinks of itself as somehow one of the core historical institutions of Scotland, right? And what does it mean to have a Scottish identity in that context? Does it matter? Is it just sort of irrelevant? What is it? So I was looking at those kinds of questions. And coming out, especially in this period of merger, were a lot of questions about kind of stereotypes, perceptions of staff across the bank, and particularly sort of Bank of Scotland staff perceptions of Halifax staff, and vice versa. And so, not to put too fine a point on it, if you look across field notes and interviews and questionnaires and stuff, you get this kind of recurring sort of micro discourse that was going on at the time. Characterizations of Scottish, you work for the Bank of Scotland, it's old, been here forever, traditional, it's prudent, Calvinist, pinch a penny kind of thing. Scots are diffident. They don't like to brag about themselves. For years before the merger, Bank of Scotland never did any television advertising. That was a bit beneath them, and we're bankers. We take our banking exams, and lots of people came out, started 17 out of school, took their banking qualifications, that sort of thing. Perception, especially on both sides, but especially the Bank of Scotland people. Halifax, the English. They're very new, they're thrusting. This is a young bank. The Halifax had demutualized about 10 years earlier, and was now a more aggressive young bank. Innovative, ready to do things differently, try new things. Too many new things. Confident, the English are, this is, again, these are national stereotypes that people who live here are quite familiar with. They're always full, able to talk about themselves. I talked to one staff trainer who said, you sit in a staff room training session with Scots on one side and English, and you say something good about yourself for 5 minutes. The Scots all sit there going, and the English guys go, yeah, I'm like this. But the other stereotype is that they're retailers. These are people who are into selling financial products. They're not real bankers like us, right? So this set of stereotypes, which is a discourse, it's, you know, if you talk to individuals and dig, they will qualify these stereotypes. They're, you know, they're never, you know, this is, you're getting at something that's going on the surface, but it's not the whole story. And the people you talk to, your ethnographic informants, are reflective and able to kind of move below the discourse and think about it critically. Nonetheless, it's there, a kind of pattern of interaction and mutual perception. So this is the kind of stuff that was coming out of the research. Now, trying to come back to documents. The main components of my documentary record of the research are the usual things. Field notes written up most days, not every day, but most days. Interview transcripts, open-ended. There was an open-ended survey administered by email to mid-level managerial staff, which provided me with lots of kind of discursive text already in kind of electronic form. And then some archive notes from going to the bank archives towards the end just to kind of chase up some details. So the question for me, and in the context of this workshop, is, you know, the recorded content obviously remains the same. I haven't gone back and doctored those field notes or anything. They're exactly the same as when I wrote them. But now I'm sort of forced to read them differently and think as I come back to this stuff and try and rethink it. So one of the issues there is a kind of shift from a resistance to change, a kind of coming out of that set of oppositions I was talking about before. Underneath that is a story of lots of Bank of Scotland people feeling, you know, grudgingly having to accept being pulled into the modern world of banking, despite the fact that they, you know, that's not what they signed up for 20 years ago, right? Versus when you look at it after the banking crisis, some of the things they're saying about being, you know, too overconfident, too over-thrusting, blah, 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 about this new way of banking are actually weirdly predictive. They're, you know, they're not, but you can't help but read it in that light. And so there's also a shift from kind of reporting, you know, organizational change, just doing a study of standard tensions and that happen when you have large-scale organizations going through this kind of change, to more emphasis on the idea of a sort of lost organizational culture, where the Bank of Scotland is not just going through changes, but in some sense being kind of digested and obliterated. Now, a point I would make about all this, if we're thinking about, well, when do documents become historical? It's simply that I'm rereading the stuff. I'm still the author of those documents. And when an ethnographer writes stuff down, it's always aide-memoire. What that's doing is calling up the experiential memory of being there and talking to those people and observing that event. And that's fundamentally different from what a historian, you know, if, you know, God forbid they should take interest in my field notes, you know, later on, would be dealing with the getting out of the documents, because for me, the documents are documents plus memory, right? And that's a very important point. I may be even ahead of time, so you know, more time for questions. We'll see. That didn't happen. Yes, sir. Go on. So let me kind of pull back and say some things about ethnography and history. One thing is to say in anthropology, there is a long tradition of doing ethnographic restudies. This is a very, is that the 5-ish mark? Yeah, that's about where I think I am. I can luxuriate in this last slide. Take one. So like a classic example is Robert Redfield's study of Tepoztlan, which is a small Mexican village in Morelos, south of Mexico City, which was then studied again about 20 years later by Oscar Lewis. And this is the old anthropologist in me coming out. You know, Redfield found a kind of world of kind of traditional folk ways, just kind of sort of in touch with a larger national culture, but also kind of preserving its ways. Lewis found a world of family conflict and urbanization and urban breakdown and poverty. Oscar Lewis is the guy who invented the term culture of poverty. So there's this classic question in anthropology: did Redfield and Lewis find what they're looking for in the same village, right? Or in 20 years, had modernization so changed the village that they saw different things, right? So there's some, you know, I'm just saying there's a long history of this kind of question of how do you put ethnography back into history and different kind of ways that this happens. In my case, the village, I remember joking the day after HBOS was taken over by Lloyd's to some of the people on the Leverhulme team that I've been a part of, you know, not every day you wake up and find that your village has been destroyed, you know, but it does happen. And in this case, you know, it's not so much that it's been destroyed, but it's, you know, absorbed by Lloyd's, a term that people used even during the Halifax Bank of Scotland merger to form HBOS. Bank of Scotland, people often said to me, well, this is a way of preserving the brand. In other words, we know that internally organizational structures and procedures and a lot of things will get changed and will be turned into a new organization in a lot of ways. At least the brand, the idea of Bank of Scotland is still there and is partly, you know, they preserve it partly just for marketing reasons because people in Scotland bank at Scottish banks. But there are questions about the, you know, the place disappearing. So, you know, I couldn't go back and restudy this place if I wanted to. It's gone. The people are, many of them have left the bank and that sort of thing. So there are classic questions of ethnographic method going on here, classic sort of dilemma of the experiential insight, the sort of more phenomenological understanding that ethnographers often get, that sort of Verstehen sense of being there by working closely with people, you know, on a day-to-day basis. But there's that side of anthropology and ethnography has always had a weak point in that often there's a lack of temporal perspective, a lack of really seeing the wider historical context of the people whose experiences you're sharing. And there's also a question of putting ethnography itself into historical context. You know, one way to deal with that problem is you do an ethnography, very kind of rich, experiential in the moment, and then you try and pack around it lots of history when you're writing it up to kind of, you know, show that you're not a fool and you understand that, you know, this is happening in some sort of context. But that's rather different from what I'm talking about today, which is the ethnographic research I did of its own accord, becoming historical. Because history is not made up of the pure elapsing of time. History, as they often say, is made up of events. And certain big events that are terribly relevant to a particular ethnographic context change the stuff retrospectively in interesting ways. So I think that's about at the line, so I'll stop there.
Okay. Thanks to Jonathan. So, yeah, maybe we've got time for a couple of quick specific questions to Jonathan, and then we'll do general discussion. So anyone? Chloe, and then Rachel, yeah?
This might be just a really naive question, but when you're doing ethnographic studies, is it just the length of time you are somewhere which reassures you that people will be acting differently in your presence? You know, so when you were in the bank doing, I mean, I don't really know anything about it, so maybe this is just a really obvious question, but I'm just curious, how do you sort of factor in the idea that people might just be responding differently to you because they know what you're doing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that question would always depend partly on the context and how sensitive it is. Yeah. And certainly in a bank context, there's a, you know, it changes. There's a kind of, I was based in the HR department, and there were a group of people that I socialized with a lot and got to know them. And it's a very familiar experience with ethnographers that there's certain, you feel there at certain points where suddenly you realize people have relaxed and they've started to assimilate you to your own category. So people, you know, eventually said, well, he's been seconded to the bank because that was much easier, because lots of people are seconded to banks to do things, and it was an easy way of assimilating me to their categories. And you socialize and get a sense. Sometimes went on staff training courses where people from other parts of the bank would be there, and I remember, you know, being in a kind of training session for basically people in structured banking, more corporate banking, bit more alpha male, shall we say, and I could tell that these guys were very uneasy with me, because I would always, wherever I went, I would always say, I'm an ethnographer doing this research. I was not clandestine in my presence. And so you just, when you sense that that's going on, you have to, you know, take that into account. As a matter of fact, one time I had some people, I would keep a little notepad where I just scribble little mnemonic reminders to myself, and it disappeared off my desk. Don't know what they made of it.
Okay, Richard.
It's a fascinating problem that you're describing, I think. But I wondered whether you'd only describe half of it, in a sense that you're trying to take account of the historical disjuncture between 2008 and now, in terms of the development and merger and absorption and disappearance of the bank. But there's your own, you're reading it necessarily through your own, what you describe as your memory, I wonder if it isn't your own intellectual history. So the question is, kind of, in what ways are you a different scholar now to the one you were in 2008, which would mean somehow taking account of what you might have read and written, and similarly the way the field is concerned, not with the everyday, but with crisis or austerity or whatever else. And I wonder if you could stand to be reflexive enough to take explicit account of what your intellectual perspective is now compared to what it was then.
Well, that's absolutely true, I mean, there's a funny sense in which I said earlier that I've actually, these days I tend to do stuff that's more like historical sociology some of the time, and I'd reached a point where I'd had enough of this, and I'd done it, it was over, and then people said, oh, there's a banking crisis, you got that banking stuff, write about it, and I said, oh, please, do I have to? But part of coming back to it and rethinking is precisely looking at it from a more thoroughly historical point of view than I probably would have at the time. But, not that I didn't have always have inclinations, historical sympathies, but that at the time of doing the research, the questions were really very kind of presentist in that classic ethnographic sense, and yes, and I've been doing a lot of reading about banking crisis and things like that. Nothing holds still. Neither you nor the
Well, that's you're in a wonderful
place.
position to kind of show that.
I'll do my best.
Okay, maybe